Laura slowly walked along the gravel path that led to the farm's shed. The sun was high, and the midday heat made the air thick, almost suffocating. The sound of cicadas echoed across the fields as she took in the tranquility of her father's property, which she hadn't visited in months. At 32, Laura lived a monotonous and predictable life in the city. Her 5-year marriage to Ricardo was far from a source of satisfaction. She knew something was missing, but she wasn't sure what it was, until that moment. As she opened the shed door, Laura came face to face with Marco, the farmhand who had always stirred something deeper in her heart. Marco was about 35 years old, with a strong, well-defined body from hard work and a presence that exuded confidence. His brown eyes were intense, and his smile carried a mix of charm and cunning. He was leaning over a workbench, adjusting a piece of equipment with a skill that drew attention. "I didn't know you were so good with tools," Marco commented, his voice laced with a seductive tone that seemed to echo through the shed. He watched Laura with an intensity that made her heart unexpectedly race. Laura looked at him, feeling the heat rise in her face. "I've always been good with my hands," she replied, a playful smile curving her lips. "But no one ever told me you were so skilled with yours." The closeness between them heightened the tension. Marco stepped closer, and the sensation of his presence was almost palpable. "Maybe you should show me what else you're good at," he whispered, his hand lightly brushing her arm. The touch was almost electric, and Laura felt a spark of desire that caught her off guard. She tried to collect herself, but her mind was swirling with questions and conflicting emotions. "What am I doing here? My marriage is stagnant, and what I really need is to feel something new, something that makes me feel alive again." The thought crossed her mind with painful clarity, and she felt the weight of her repressed desires growing heavier by the second. "Who knows? Maybe I could show you a little more of my skills, Marco," Laura replied, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that matched the growing tension in the room. The suggestion hung in the air, but nothing could have prepared him for what she was about to propose. Laura moved closer, her lips almost brushing his, and whispered something he never expected. The words that left her lips at that moment had the power to change everything. If you're enjoying this story and want to know what Laura proposed to Marco, stay until the end of this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our content. Laura felt Marco's breath on her neck as he stood so close that she could almost touch his lips. With a sly smile, she tilted her head slightly, her lips nearly brushing Marco's ear as she whispered, "Do you have a spot reserved just for the two of us, Marco?" Laura whispered, her voice a warm murmur that made Marco shiver. "A place where we can talk without interruptions, maybe where you can show me a little more of what's hidden behind those mysterious eyes." Her words lingered in the air, laden with an indecipherable promise. Marco felt a chill run down his spine, Laura's suggestion transforming the atmosphere into something more charged and intimate. His gaze met hers, and the intensity of the moment drew him even closer, the tension almost unbearable. "What are you suggesting, Laura?" Marco asked, his voice a deep and seductive murmur. "What kind of conversation do you have in mind?" Laura chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to be a mix of amusement and provocation. "Just a more personal conversation. And who knows, maybe a chance to discover what's behind that charm of yours." Marco couldn't help but smile. "You have a unique way of making a proposal, Laura. I'm very interested in seeing just how far you're willing to go." The closeness between them intensified, the distance reduced to just a mere touch, the heat between them growing stronger by the second. Laura felt her heart race, her mind swirling with the realization that she was venturing into unknown but thrilling territory. "Let's get out of here," Marco suggested, his voice a bit more commanding. "There's a more private spot at the back of the property where we can talk more quietly." Laura hesitated for a moment, an internal conflict evident in her eyes. The desire was undeniable, but there was also a pang of guilt, a sense of betrayal that made her question her choices. Yet the curiosity and desire were strong enough to keep her there. "What am I doing?" Laura thought, feeling the mix of excitement and guilt. "This man attracts me in a way I never expected, And maybe, just maybe, I need this change to feel something new. With a nod, Laura agreed. Let's go then. Show me this private spot. As they left the shed, the air thick with possibilities, it became clear that what was about to happen would challenge their emotions and their limits. The sun was beginning to set as Laura and Marco arrived at a small shelter in the back of the property, a secluded spot full of rustic charm. The space was illuminated only by the soft light of the evening, creating an intimate and captivating atmosphere. Marco moved closer to Laura, his gaze fixed on her as he watched her settle into a wooden chair. "Here we are," he said, his voice laden with an unspoken promise. "A place where we won't be interrupted." Laura made herself comfortable, her eyes shining with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. "It's perfect," she murmured, feeling the warmth of the setting and Marco's presence. "Now, where's that conversation you promised?" Marco smiled, his expression showing genuine interest. "The conversation could start with a kiss," he suggested, moving closer to her. His lips were just inches from hers. Laura felt her heart race. "Do you think a kiss is a proper way to begin?" Marco leaned in a little more, his lips finally meeting hers in a soft, tantalizing kiss. The touch was delicate, yet filled with suppressed passion, a preview of what was to come. Laura responded to the kiss with an intensity she hadn't expected, her hands finding Marco's face and pulling him closer. When they pulled away, both were breathless, the heat from the kiss still coursing through their veins. Marco looked at Laura with a satisfied smile. "I think we started off well." Laura smiled back, her eyes gleaming with a mix of desire and curiosity. "Definitely. But this is just the beginning, right?" Marco nodded, his gaze heavy with promises and unspoken intentions. "Yes, definitely. And I'm eager to see what else you have in mind." The conversation continued, with subtle touches and intense glances, every word and gesture carrying a subtext of desire and temptation. Laura knew she was walking a fine line between desire and betrayal, but the attraction she felt for Marco was making each moment more irresistible. Days passed, and Laura couldn't forget the kiss with Marco. Desire and curiosity consumed her, and the thought of seeing him again became more and more tempting. Finally, she decided to seek out Marco, suggesting a meeting in a more private place. The new meeting took place in a small cabin on the farm, a spot where they could be alone without worries. When Laura walked in, Marco was there waiting, his smile filled with palpable anticipation. "You came," Marco said, approaching her with a look that seemed to see right through her facade. "Of course," Laura replied with a soft smile. "I couldn't stay away." The room was lit by candles, creating an atmosphere that made Laura's heart race. Marco stepped closer, his fingers brushing against hers with a lightness that only intensified the desire. "I have something for you," he said, pulling her closer. Laura looked at him, their eyes meeting with an intensity that carried a promise of more. "What is it?" Without answering, Marco leaned in and kissed her again, this kiss deeper and more passionate than the last. Laura surrendered to the kiss, her hands moving to wrap around Marco's neck as the intensity between them grew. After the kiss, both were breathless. Marco looked at Laura, his gaze filled with an unsatisfied desire. "You know this is getting harder to resist, don't you?" Laura laughed softly. "I know. And honestly, I'm not sure if I want to resist." The encounter continued with conversation and gentle touches, each moment charged with an expectation that promised something deeper. The night was quiet, the sound of the wind in the trees creating a soft soundtrack for what was about to unfold. Laura and Marco were back in the cabin, the atmosphere thick with an anticipation that promised something more intense. Laura stepped closer to Marco, her eyes meeting his with a mix of desire and hesitation. "I want to be with you, Marco," she said, her voice a whisper filled with emotion. Marco looked at her, his heart racing with the intensity of the moment. "I want that too, Laura. More than you can imagine." With a gentle gesture, Marco began unbuttoning Laura's blouse, his fingers exploring her skin with a tenderness that contrasted with the desire they both felt. Laura surrendered to his touch, her breath quickening with the closeness and intensity. Their lovemaking unfolded with a subtle elegance. Every touch and movement focused on the sensations and emotions they were experiencing. Laura and Marco gave themselves to each other, their emotions entwining in a moment of deep satisfaction. The connection between them was palpable, and Laura felt a mix of fulfillment and confusion. She knew she had crossed a line, but the experience made her feel more alive than ever before. The return to reality was abrupt for Laura, who found her husband, James, waiting for her at home with a worried expression. The confrontation was inevitable, and Laura felt guilt and fear mix with the satisfaction of what she had experienced with Marco. "Laura, you're different," James said, his voice full of concern. "Is something going on with you?" Laura tried to hide the inner turmoil, but knew it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain appearances. Satisfaction and guilt swirled together, creating a tension that made her feel even more uncomfortable. James was watching her closely, his concern evident. "It's nothing," Laura tried to say, her voice slightly shaky. "I've just been tired, that's all." James didn't seem convinced. "You're different. Like you're distant. I'm worried about you." Laura felt a tightness in her chest, her conflicting emotions creating a whirlwind inside her. The experience with Marco had been intense and thrilling, but returning to everyday life was forcing her to put her choices into perspective. She was beginning to question whether what she was doing was worth it, whether the fleeting desire was really what she needed to fill the emptiness she felt. She looked at James, her eyes reflecting the pain and doubt she was feeling. "I know I've been distant, but it's just a passing phase, I promise." The guilt and the fear of being discovered weighed heavily on her, and every moment with Marco seemed to consume her mind and heart. As she spoke with James, Laura couldn't stop thinking about Marco and the depth of the connection they had shared. The next day, Laura met Marco at a cafe, a place where they could talk away from curious eyes. The meeting was charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. "I can't keep doing this, Marco," Laura said, her voice tense and filled with emotion. "What we're doing is affecting my life in ways I can't control." Marco looked at her seriously, sensing the gravity of the situation. "I understand, Laura, but what do you really want to do now? Keep going like this, or make a change?" Laura felt a lump in her throat, her emotions on edge. "I don't know. The experience was amazing, but I also feel like I'm losing control. I need to decide what I really want." The conversation continued with raw honesty, both reflecting on the choices they had made and the consequences they were facing. The tension between them was palpable, and Laura knew she had to confront the reality of her situation. "Have you thought about what you're going to do about James?" Marco asked, his voice full of concern. "He might be starting to get suspicious." Laura sighed, her mind racing with thoughts of the future. "Yes, I've been thinking about it, and I don't know what to do. I feel trapped between two worlds with no clear way out." The conversation ended with a sense of uncertainty, and Laura walked away with an even more tumultuous mind than before. What do you think will happen next in Laura's life? Will she be able to deal with the consequences of her choices? How would you react if you were in Laura's place, facing a dilemma between overwhelming desire and a stable relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments.